The alarm clock blinked 6:47 a.m. 2 minutes late. Nathan's gut twisted. Olivia always knocked at 6:45. Something was wrong. He sat up in bed, the sheets tangled around his legs, and listened. The house was quiet. Too quiet. No soft footsteps. In the hallway, no hum of Olivia's voice as she chattered to herself about the day ahead. Just the faint ticking of the clock and the distant sound of wind rattling the windows. Nathan swung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor. He called her name, his voice cracking slightly. "Olivia?" No answer. He moved quickly, his heart pounding as he crossed the room and opened the door. The hallway was empty, the dim morning light casting long shadows across the walls. Olivia's door was slightly ajar, and Nathan pushed it open, his breath catching in his throat. Her bed was neatly made, the pink comforter smooth and untouched. Her backpack sat by the desk, but when he picked it up, it felt strangely light. He unzipped it, his hands trembling, and found it nearly empty. Just a single notebook and a half-eaten granola bar. No textbooks, no lunchbox, no water bottle. His stomach churned. Olivia never left without packing her bag the night before. She was meticulous, almost obsessive, about her routine. Nathan's eyes darted to her desk. Her journal, the one she wrote in every night before bed, was gone. The small leather-bound book with the gold star sticker on the cover was always there, always in the same spot. But now, the space where it usually sat was empty. He felt a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. "Olivia!" he called again, louder this time, his voice echoing through the house. Still no answer. He checked the bathroom, the kitchen, the living room. Nothing. No sign of her. The house felt hollow, like it was holding its breath. He grabbed his phone and dialed his wife, Sarah, who was already at work. "Olivia's not here," he said, as soon as she picked up, his voice tight with panic. "What do you mean she's not there?" Sarah's tone was sharp, laced with fear. "I mean, she's gone. Her bed's made, her backpack's empty, and her journal's missing. She's not in the house." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Nathan could hear Sarah's quick, shallow breaths. "Check the closet," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The one in her room. She's been acting strange lately. I didn't want to worry you, but she's been spending a lot of time in there." Nathan's chest tightened. He hadn't noticed anything unusual about Olivia's behavior, or at least he hadn't thought much of it. She'd been quieter than usual, sure, but he'd chalked it up to her being tired or preoccupied with school. Now, though, the pieces were starting to come together in a way that made his skin crawl. He hurried back to Olivia's room, his pulse racing. The closet door was closed, just as it always was. He reached for the handle, his hand shaking, and pulled it open. The closet was dark, the faint smell of cedar and dust hitting him as he stepped inside. He fumbled for the light switch, his fingers brushing against the wall until he found it. The single bulb flickered to life, casting a dim glow over the small space. And there, huddled in the corner with her knees pulled to her chest and her face buried in her arms, was Olivia. She was trembling, her small frame shaking like a leaf in the wind. Nathan dropped to his knees beside her, his heart breaking at the sight. "Olivia," he said softly, reaching out to touch her shoulder. She flinched, her head snapping up, and for a moment she looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. Then she lunged forward, wrapping her arms around his neck and clinging to him like she was afraid he'd disappear. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm scared." Nathan held her tightly, his mind racing. What could have scared her so badly that she'd lock herself in a closet? He pulled back slightly, brushing her hair away from her face. "What's wrong, sweetheart? What happened?" Olivia shook her head, her lips pressed together in a tight line. She wouldn't or couldn't answer. Nathan's stomach churned. He didn't know what was going on, but one thing was clear. Whatever it was bad. And he had no idea how to fix it. Nathan tried to shake off the unease that had settled over him like a heavy blanket. Olivia had been quiet at breakfast, pushing her food around her plate with a fork, but barely eating. She'd always been a picky eater, but this was different. She looked pale, her usual spark gone, and she hadn't said more than a few words since he'd found her in the closet that morning. "You feeling okay, kiddo?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light. Olivia nodded without looking up, her eyes fixed on her plate. "Yeah," she mumbled. "Just not hungry." Nathan exchanged a worried glance with Sarah, who was sipping her coffee at the other end of the table. She gave him a small, reassuring smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Over the next few days, Nathan noticed more little things that didn't add up. Olivia, who used to chatter nonstop about school and her friends, now spent most of her time in her room with the door closed. When she did come out, she seemed jumpy, like she was constantly on edge. Once, Nathan walked past the bathroom and heard her crying softly, the sound muffled by the door. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the knob, but before he could knock, the crying stopped, and he heard the faucet turn on. He told himself it was nothing, just teenage mood swings, like Sarah had said. But deep down, he wasn't convinced. Then, there were the messages. Olivia's phone, which she used to leave lying around everywhere, was now always in her pocket or clutched tightly in her hand. Nathan caught glimpses of the screen lighting up with notifications, but whenever he asked who she was texting, she'd quickly lock the phone and shove it away. "Just friends," she'd say, her voice flat. But Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One night, after Olivia had gone to bed, he found himself standing in her room, staring at the closet door. It was closed, just like it had been that morning when he'd found her inside. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he was missing. He knelt beside her bed, his hand brushing against the edge of the mattress. That's when he saw it, a crumpled piece of paper, half hidden under the bed. He pulled it out, his heart pounding as he unfolded it. The handwriting wasn't Olivia's. It was messy, the letters scrawled in jagged lines that looked like they'd been written in a hurry. The message was short, just 4 words, but they sent a chill down his spine. "You don't belong here." Nathan stared at the note, his mind racing. Who had written it? And why had Olivia hidden it under her bed? He folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his pocket, his hands trembling. Whatever was going on, it was bigger than he'd thought, and he was starting to realize that he might not be able to protect Olivia from it. The next morning, Nathan tried to talk to Sarah about what he'd found, but she brushed him off. "She's just going through a phase," Sarah said, her voice tight with frustration. "You're overreacting." Nathan wanted to believe her, but the note burned a hole in his pocket, a constant reminder that something was wrong. He decided to keep an eye on Olivia, watching her more closely than ever. But the more he watched, the more he noticed. The way she flinched at sudden noises, the way she avoided certain hallways in the house, the way she sometimes stared at the closet door like she was waiting for something to happen. One evening, as Nathan was cleaning up after dinner, he heard Olivia's phone buzz from where it sat on the counter. He glanced at the screen, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the message preview. "You can't hide forever." Before he could read more, Olivia appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with panic. She snatched the phone off the counter and shoved it into her pocket, her face pale. "Who's texting you?" Nathan asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Olivia shook her head, her lips pressed together in a tight line. "No one," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Just a prank." Nathan wanted to press her, to demand answers, but the look in her eyes stopped him. She looked terrified. Not of him, but of something else. Something he couldn't see. That night, Nathan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, but his mind was anything but. He kept thinking about the note, the messages, the way Olivia had locked herself in the closet. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was going on, it was real, and it was getting worse. He just didn't know how to stop it. Nathan couldn't sleep. The house was quiet, but his mind was a storm of worry and fear. He kept replaying the events of the past few days in his head. Olivia's strange behavior, the cryptic messages, the note he'd found under her bed. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to give way. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He got out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah, and crept down the hallway to Olivia's room. The door was slightly ajar, and he pushed it open, his heart pounding. Olivia was asleep, her face peaceful for the first time in days. Nathan stood there for a moment, watching her, before his eyes drifted to her desk. Her journal, the one she'd been so protective of, was sitting there, the gold star sticker catching the faint light from the hallway. He hesitated, guilt gnawing at him. He knew he shouldn't invade her privacy, but he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was going on, the answers were in that book. He glanced at Olivia one more time, then quietly picked up the journal and slipped out of the room. Back in the kitchen, Nathan sat at the table, the journal in front of him. He took a deep breath and opened it. The first few pages were filled with Olivia's usual thoughts, notes about school, doodles of flowers and animals, lists of her favorite books. But as he flipped through the pages, the tone changed. The handwriting became messier, the words darker. He stopped on a page near Baitigi. The middle, his heart sinking as he read the words scrawled across the top. "Why I want to disappear." Nathan's hands trembled as he read the list Olivia had written. Each reason was like a punch to the gut. "No one likes me. I'm a burden. I don't belong here." His vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. He turned the page, and what he saw next made his blood run cold. There were screenshots of messages, cruel, hateful words from people Olivia had once called friends. "You're worthless. No one would miss you if you were gone. Why don't you just disappear?" The messages were relentless, a barrage of cruelty that seemed never-ending. And then there were the threats. Anonymous messages warning Olivia to stay quiet, to keep her head down, or else. Nathan's chest tightened, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He felt like the walls were closing in around him. How had he not seen this? How had he missed the signs? He thought back to the times Olivia had seemed distant, the nights she'd spent locked in her room, the way she'd flinched at every noise. He'd thought it was just teenage angst. But now he realized the truth. His daughter was being tormented, and he'd been blind to it. He closed the journal, his hands shaking, and stared at the cover. The gold star sticker seemed to mock him now, a symbol of the bright, happy child Olivia had once been. He didn't know what to do. Should he confront her? Should he tell Sarah? Should he call the police? His mind raced, each option feeling more impossible than the last. But one thing was clear. He couldn't do nothing. Not anymore. Nathan grabbed his phone and dialed 911, his fingers trembling as he pressed the numbers. The operator's voice was calm and steady, but Nathan could barely get the words out. "My daughter. She's in trouble. She's being bullied, threatened. I don't know what to do." The operator asked him questions, but Nathan could barely focus. All he could think about was Olivia, alone and scared, carrying this weight all by herself. When the call ended, Nathan sat there for a moment, his head in his hands. Then he stood up and walked back to Olivia's room. She was still asleep, her face peaceful. But Nathan knew that peace was fragile. He knelt beside her bed and gently shook her shoulder. "Olivia," he whispered. "Wake up, sweetheart. We need to talk." Olivia's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she looked confused. Then she saw the journal in Nathan's hand, and her face went pale. "Daddy," she started, but Nathan cut her off. "It's okay," he said, his voice breaking. "I know, and we're going to fix this. I promise." Olivia's eyes filled with tears, and she threw her arms around him, clinging to him like she was afraid he'd let go. Nathan held her tightly, his own tears falling as he realized just how close he'd come to losing her. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt his little girl ever again. The sound of sirens cut through the quiet of the night, growing louder as they approached the house. Nathan stood by the window, watching as red and blue lights flashed across the front yard. His heart was pounding, his hands still trembling from the weight of what he'd discovered. Olivia sat on the couch, her knees pulled to her chest, her face pale and tear-streaked. She hadn't said much since he'd woken her, and Nathan didn't push her. He knew she was scared, and he didn't want to make it worse. Sarah came rushing down the stairs, her hair disheveled and her eyes wide with panic. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "Why are the police here?" Nathan turned to her, his throat tight. "It's Olivia," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She's been bullied, threatened. I found her journal. It's bad, Sarah. Really bad." Sarah's face went pale, and she looked at Olivia, who was staring at the floor, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Olivia?" Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Is this true?" Olivia didn't answer. She just shook her head, her tears falling silently. Before Sarah could say anything else, there was a knock at the door. Nathan opened it to find two police officers standing on the porch, their expressions serious but kind. "We got a call about a possible bullying situation," one of them said. "Can we come in?" Nathan nodded and stepped aside, his stomach churning as the officers entered the house. The next hour was a blur. The officers asked Olivia questions, their voices gentle but firm. At first, she was hesitant, her answers short and mumbled. But as they pressed her, the dam broke. She started talking, her voice shaking as she described the messages, the threats, the way her so-called friends had turned on her. She told them about the note she'd found in her locker, the one that said, "You don't belong here." She told them about the nights she'd spent crying in her closet, too scared to tell anyone what was happening. And then, finally, she told them about the list, the one she'd written in her journal, the one that had made Nathan's blood run cold. Sarah sat on the couch, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Nathan stood by the window, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw clenched. He felt like he was drowning. the weight of guilt and fear pressing down on him. How had he not seen this? How had he let it get this bad? When Olivia finished speaking, the room was silent except for the sound of her quiet sobs. One of the officers knelt in front of her, his voice soft. "You're very brave for telling us this," he said. "We're going to do everything we can to make sure this stops, okay?" Olivia nodded, but she didn't look up. The officer stood and turned to Nathan and Sarah. "We'll need to take a statement from both of you as well," he said. "And we'll need to see the journal and any other evidence you have." Nathan handed over the journal, his hands shaking. As the officers flipped through the pages, he felt a surge of anger. Not at Olivia, but at himself. He should have seen the signs. He should have done something sooner. But it was too late for regrets now. All he could do was try to fix it. After the officers left, promising to follow up in the morning, the house was eerily quiet. Sarah sat on the couch, staring at the floor, her face pale and drawn. Olivia was still curled up in the corner of the couch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Nathan knelt in front of her, his heart breaking at the sight of her tear-streaked face. "Olivia," he said softly, "I'm so sorry. I should have noticed. I should have done something." Olivia looked at him, her eyes red and swollen. "You read my journal," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You had no right." Nathan flinched, the guilt hitting him like a punch to the gut. "I know," he said, his voice breaking. "And I'm sorry. But I was scared, Olivia. I didn't know what else to do." For a moment, Olivia just stared at him, her chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. Then, to his surprise, she threw her arms around him, burying her face in his shoulder. "I'm scared too," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Nathan held her tightly, his own tears falling as he realized just how close he'd come to losing her. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt his little girl ever again. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change. Olivia started seeing a therapist, someone who could help her process the trauma she'd been through. At first, she was hesitant, her walls still up, but slowly she began to open up. Nathan and Sarah made a point to be more present, to really listen when she spoke, to notice the little things they'd once overlooked. Family dinners became a non-negotiable part of their routine, a time to connect and check in. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, still nights, when Olivia would wake up crying, but it was progress. The school took the situation seriously. The bullies were identified and faced consequences, some more severe than others. Olivia didn't have to see them every day. Arrangements were made to ensure she felt safe. But the story wasn't about revenge. It was about survival, about finding a way to move forward even when the weight of what had happened felt unbearable. Olivia began to rebuild her confidence, one small step at a time. She joined an art class, something she'd always been interested in but never pursued. It became her outlet, a way to express the emotions she couldn't always put into words. Nathan watched her closely, his heart swelling with pride every time he saw a glimpse of the old Olivia, the one who laughed easily, who found joy in the little things. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Olivia turned to him with a small smile. It was the first real smile he'd seen from her in months, and it took his breath away. "You saved me," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Nathan felt a lump form in his throat. He reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You saved yourself, kiddo," he said. "I just gave you a little push." Olivia shook her head, her smile fading slightly. "No," she said. "You saw me when no one else did. You didn't give up on me." Nathan didn't know what to say. He just pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink. As the days turned into weeks, Nathan found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. Some things would never be the same. Olivia's innocence had been shattered, and the scars of what she'd been through would always be there. But there was hope, too. They were closer as a family, more aware of each other's struggles, more willing to fight for one another. Nathan realized that while he couldn't protect Olivia from everything, he could be there for her, no matter what. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Olivia working on a new painting and Nathan reading a book, she looked up at him and said, "I think I'm going to be okay." Her voice was quiet but confident, and Nathan felt a surge of emotion. He set his book down and smiled at her. "I know you are," he said, "and I'll be right here, every step of the way." The future was still uncertain, but it was brighter than it had been in a long time. As Nathan watched Olivia dip her brush into a vibrant shade of blue, he realized that sometimes healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about finding the strength to paint over it, one stroke at a time. And as the final brush stroke dried, Nathan knew they were going to be okay. "You saved me," Olivia had said. But as Nathan sat there watching her smile, he realized she'd saved him too.